Hi, and welcome to this episode of the Leadership Untitled Podcast, the show that brings experts in the world of L&D and or leadership to share their tips, their experience and their insights to help you avoid the traps that many of us have actually fallen into ourselves. My guest this week is Nick Shackleton-Jones. Nick's held a number of senior L&D roles spanning companies such as Siemens, BBC, BP, and is now the HR director for Deloitte UK. Perhaps most significantly, however, is his 2019 book, How People Learn, where Nick not only explored design principles of his own, which he calls the 5DI model, but also common approaches such as gamification, education, and highlights their limitation compared to actually finding and targeting what people are actually concerned about. So, time to explore all that and more as I welcome Nick to the Leadership Untitled podcast. So, hi Nick, thanks for joining the Leadership Untitled podcast. How are you today?
I'm good, yeah. How are you?
I'm brilliant, thank you. Yeah, it's actually quite a sunny day for a change, which we've not had many of recently. Rain, snow and rain.
Yeah, so we started talking about the weather. That's,
There you go.
That's the script, isn't it? Yeah,
That's the script.
I'm doing well. So yeah, it's good to see you, and thank you very much for inviting me on the podcast.
What's it like in Paris at the minute? You've got.
Yeah, well, this is my proper. People think it's some kind of virtual stuff, but as you can see, it's like my real wallpaper.
Yeah.
It's just that when lockdown sort of hit, I thought, I'm going to be spending a lot of time on these Zoom calls. I wonder where's the best place for me to stand. And I thought, well, there's a bit of interesting backdrop and good lighting from the garden that way. So yeah, but it's my real wallpaper.
No, I've found that with so many people. I find it absolutely intriguing where people choose to sit themselves. Normally, I think the bog standard one has been in front of so many books, you get a headache just to prove that they read so many of them.
Yeah, all of these books I've read.
Yes,
I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? And I suppose in a kind of a world where there's a kind of paucity of excitement in the meetings, it's quite interesting, if mildly appropriate to kind of peer at people's environment. The reality though is I'm in Bracknell, not Paris. Which somebody once described as like Weatherspoons built a town. It's like all a bit crap, which if you're listening and you're from Bracknell, I'd sort of apologize deeply for. I quite like it in Bracknell, but it's not Paris. Well,
I imagine it's lovely. Yes. Well, people like Weatherspoons. There's a reason to be there rather than other pubs. For some.
Yeah.
Brilliant stuff. Well, yeah, thank you for joining me today. I mean, it's an honor to have you on the show. And I think what really attracted me to your way of thinking, I first was introduced to you by listening to David James's podcast. And I've had David on the show as well. And what I really liked about the way you talk, and obviously the stuff that you've written and put onto YouTube about the way you think, is that it isn't just about the learning element, whilst it is about how people learn. It's also about then, well, where are we trying to actually get to in society? And one of the things that you talk about in your book and pretty much all of your content is learning eliminators. Which I think is, it's an interesting concept. So do you want to take us through what you mean by that and how that actually comes to life?
Yes. And I suppose I've been consistently provocative for a sort of a number of years, and I'm not doing that to upset people. It's my experience that lots of industries tend to settle into a set of rituals and assumptions which go along with those. And really, sometimes if you want to change things in hopefully a better direction, you really sometimes have to shake people to wake them. So the idea behind learning elimination is actually probably, as I've been saying for a number of years, we're at an inflection point where our role has actually shifted from driving learning to actually learning elimination. And that for some people is kind of quite a shocking thing, especially if they've sort of been attached to the idea of learning as many of us are for a number of years. But the reason I say that I think is good, which is that, ideas like performance support and performance consulting have been around for many years. They predate me by many years. People like Bob Moshe have been driving them for a bit. But at the heart of that is a much more radical idea. And unless you express it, more directly as learning elimination, people perhaps don't get what's being said. And the point is this: maybe our job isn't just to kind of push content at people. Maybe our job is actually to help them to do their jobs. And if we were going to help them to do their jobs, the best way to do that might not be more courses and more courseware and more e-learning and more modules. And the example I use over and over again is, the underground map.
Mm.
So if you look at the underground, is the underground map micro learning? No. Is it a nugget? No. Is it a course? Is it a module? It's none of those things. It's a resource, and it eliminates your need to learn. And I know this
Mm.
because I've been traveling around London for years, if not decades. And the fact that I use the London Underground helps me perform. I can get from A to B really effectively, but it's actually prevented me from learning because I don't need to. It's made my life a lot easier. And
Yeah.
we're moving towards a world where there's going to be much more rapidity and this kind of a pace of change. And what people keep saying, and is wrong, I should be really clear about that, is that, well, we're going to have to learn more, 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 more. No, we're going to have to eliminate learning much more effectively so that you can just get stuff done in
Mm.
any job very quickly without having a mountain of learning that you're going to have to cover before you do it. So this idea of learning elimination is much more than just me sort of poking the industry a bit. It's actually saying, I think that if we really want to help people in our businesses perform, the best way that we can do that is to reduce their need to learn as effectively as possible. And we can do that with resources and performance support and performance guidance.
Absolutely. I mean, the idea of learning in the flow of work again isn't a new one, but it's very much a popular one. And I think it's right because, like you say, so many times learning interventions, as we've liked to call them over the years, do exactly that. They intervene in what we're trying to actually do.
Yeah.
And I do love your underground example because it made me think, because I know you talk about sat navs as well quite a lot in terms of obviously we had to try and remember directions. Then we had the maps to help us not have to remember that. Then we've got the sat navs that basically, and I think the key word here is contextualize that for us. So they put us into where we actually are at the moment and actually
Yeah.
utilize that information for us. And I thought it made me think of a much more manual example than that. But I remember so many times when I was younger going around Alton Towers with that big foldable map that they give you.
Mm.
And, maybe 1 in 100 times it was useful. But what was most useful is finding the actual static boards around various points that said, you are here.
Yeah.
Now that actually helped me. I figure out
Yeah.
where do I need to go next.
I like that analogy. No, imagine by contrast, you got to Alton Towers and they said, before we let you loose in the park, we're going to run you a 2-hour learning session where you're going to memorize, all of the routes around and familiarize yourself with all the things. You say, well, this is rubbish.
Yeah.
Why would you do that?
Oh, exactly. And you know what? I think it's an interesting thing there that we're sort of going into the realm of thinking about customers now rather than people who work for us in the organizations. And well, I personally try and think of them as the same thing, that they are both customers or clients or whatever your terminology is of what I try to do. But an example I use quite a lot is that if an organization on its webpage expected a customer to jump through 3 or 4 or 5 different systems to buy their product, and then there was also a help system to help them use 2 or 3 or 4 of those systems they were logging into. And there were also different usernames and passwords to log into each of those systems. We wouldn't sell anything. And someone would probably get sacked very quickly for designing such an appalling user experience.
Mm.
But that's exactly what tends to happen. Certainly in my experiences in some of the telecoms companies in call centers, when it comes to our customers who are on the phone to our commercial customers, those frontline staff, they have exactly that. They have multiple systems and they're expected to either remember or go on a 3-week course to remember and then be tested on it on a simulation of it, not the actual thing, which I always compare to, trying to learn to ride a bike in a training room. How's that going to work?
Mm.
Why do we do that? Why is the priority on the outside? And it seems so clear what we need to do, but then when we
Well,
look back internally,
I love that. That's a kind of a beautiful comparison. It makes a lot of sense to me. So I heard an interview, I think, not long ago with, I think, the CEO of Domino's. It's prior to kind of COVID and everything. And they'd seen a huge increase in sales of pizza. And he was being interviewed on Radio 4. And they said, how do you account for this, massive improvement in your business? And he said, oh, it's easy, really. We just made it really easy for people to order pizza. So they built an app and it was like a one button, it remembered your preferences. So basically, you just hit the button, you get pizza. And the point is that with our external customers, we understand that if we make it really hard for them to buy the product, then we will lose business and ultimately go out of business. But with our internal customer, the impact is on performance and engagement. And we're not very good at measuring those. In fact, most organizations have been in just hopeless in terms of really measuring performance engagement. So what we do is we put all of these hurdles in their way. We make it really hard for them to do their jobs. We literally do. And it's like they join at very high levels of engagement. Most people, when they join an organization, 80% engaged, a few months in, and we've massively driven that downhill. And one assumes performance in like fashion, and we've done that by making it really hard for them to get stuff done. Everybody joins wanting to do their job, we just make it really difficult. And what nobody's doing is ironing out the UX for our internal customers. Nobody's talking to customers and actually saying, how can we make it easier for you to do your job? My argument is that is our role, and it's a wonderful role. That's what we should be doing. We should be getting together groups of new starters or leaders or people in technical roles and saying, what's tough about your role and how can we help you? And that will lift performance and engagement. And that's my mission. That's our mission at Deloitte, to measurably improve performance and engagement. Now, learning may be one of the levers we can pull, but other things like performance support or resources may be another. But the impact is felt in the business. Our performance drops, our engagement drops. We just don't measure it in the same way that you would with sales of your product externally.
Exactly that. And I think, we so often talk about business alignment of L&D with those people, but it's alignment all the way through. So to actually, for companies, and I think you're absolutely right, companies don't see the fact that the way that they design that UX for their people will actually impact whether you get customers or lose customers or not. It's just because it's not explicit to them. It's not the customer themselves trying to buy something. It's sometimes lost in that translation, or the budget goes on the fluffy stuff that everyone sees out there, the adverts or whatever it might be. I think it's really interesting conversation. To that point,
it is. I mean, but just before you move on, I mean, because we do a lot of audience research, I spend a lot of time talking to people, new starters to organizations or, new leaders. And quite often they'll say things like, and I guess people listening to this will recognize it, it takes 6 months to a year to find your feet. So you're carrying the cost of that as a business. It's as simple as that. So for 6 months to a year, there are varying degrees of ineffective, unproductive. And you just accept that, because it doesn't occur to anybody that actually you could make it easy for people to do their jobs and dramatically reduce that time frame.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, I actually wrote a blog. It was my time when I was with Talk, and it was addressed to everybody, but ultimately I wanted the audience, senior leaders, to really read this and think about it, because I said, if I was to say to you that if you left the organization tomorrow as a head of or a director, we could replace you tomorrow and never know you were there. And obviously, from a personal pride point of view, they went, well, no, someone can't come straight in and do all that. It's taken me years to build all this up. Okay, that's interesting. What if I just like spent 3 weeks with them? Then they'd be as good as you. No, it takes years to build this up. And that's interesting. But you think I can do that to all the new starters that come in that do all these other jobs? Maybe not. How do we do that? I think it's L&D then. Why do we do it? Why do we continue? Because I think, there's Dave Ulrich once said the purpose of HR, and by proxy quite many organizations, L&D, is to make ourselves redundant. Yet we do all these things that seem to me like we're actually trying to do the opposite and make sure we don't get made redundant. What's your take on it?
I think it's because fundamentally, and you asked this question, I think in the questions to think about, it's like, why do we see so many sort of transformations in L&D? And one of the things that I realized in my career is that all the big questions that we were trying to answer, how do you design learning, how do you do business alignment, how do you evaluate learning, couldn't be answered unless you had a really kind of basic understanding of learning on which to base your practice. A foundation, if you like. And so in the absence of that, I think the answer to your question is just rain dancing, is that we're just doing this sort of activity that's sort of accepted within businesses. We've never really been able to say kind of how that actually translates into the weather or the rain or the performance. But there's, it just continues. But what happens is that every so often somebody will come along and say, this rain dance isn't working. And then somebody else will say, well, I'm going to try and do a different rain dance. And then somebody does a different rain dance, and then it transpires that that's not working. And then so let me try something different. But and until we actually get to an understanding of learning, which is why I wrote How People Learn, because I eventually realized I wasn't going to be able to answer any of these bigger questions about, learning design without really kind of getting to the bottom of it. Until that happens, we will just continue a series of weirdly ritualized behaviors, and it will be driven by trends and fads in the industry. There'll be micro learning, which I've been quite critical of, which is a new thing, and we'll look at that for a little while and spend some money on it, and it won't make a difference, and then we'll move on to something else.
Exactly that. No, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm sure you'll say the same, that I can put my hands up and say I've been part of the problem over the years. I've actually marched out and showed people the flip charts in which we've
Yeah,
covered the content that they seem not
yeah,
to remember, or taking
yeah.
a personal slight that you're saying you didn't cover it in that 6 weeks we spent together. How dare you? But at the same time, what I also notice in the industry, in everywhere I've worked in the last sort of 10 years, there are now pockets of L&D professionals who are thinking in this different way, and are maybe struggling to get it into practice, but are trying and are fighting that status quo to do it. But then when it gets to a certain level in the organization, and quite often a certain urgency, it just breaks. What's the reason that when it gets to that level, do you think? So, and again, in my experience, below the sort of senior leadership level, does that desire for change stop?
The central problem with learning transformation is that people see it as a transformation of kind of resource or whatever, or kind of focus or budget, whatever, when really it has to be a transformation of mindset. And what I mean by that is your fundamental problem, at the risk of sound philosophical, is convention. So quite often, as you try to do things, you'll encounter stakeholders who have a conventional model of learning, which is that learning is education, and they will have gone through education, and their experience of it will be that effectively it's content dumping, that you get people together, either virtually or face to face, and that you just push content at them via a series of slides. And that model kind of persists at those quite levels of seniority. And so in trying to kind of change things, you eventually encounter this convention that no, your job is just to kind of take this document and to kind of push it out via whatever mechanism is trendy at the moment. And that it takes quite a lot of effort to change the mindset. And what I've found in my past work is that you have to show, not say. And this is always our challenge, I think, is that as learning professionals, you and I can connect around this. We probably have quite a lot of overlap in our understanding of it. But for many of our customers, that overlap isn't there. So, and they're not part of this podcast or conversation on a regular basis. So we have to somehow cut through that, difference, and actually destination postcards, and actually showing, not saying, actually saying, look at this. Here's something we could be doing that would be very different. Should we give that a go? Is going to be more effective than just kind of cycling through what will feel like a quote learning, kind of conversation or training jargon.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a guy on, I think he's a sales mentor and presenter, a guy called Andy Bounds, who's on LinkedIn a lot, and he's got a model which is a sales model, but I think this is one of the things that L&D don't do very well. Linking to what you've just been saying, there is sell the vision of where we're going and what we're trying to achieve. And Andy's model basically says we spend too much time, or people in general, when they're selling or promoting their service, talking about what they've done in the past, and then maybe blending into what they can do in the future, rather than starting immediately with how we can help your future as a customer. And I think you're right that when we talk to those senior leaders, it's very much, well, what we've done in the past is this. We've now justified our place here. Great. And what we can do is start using things like virtual reality and augmented reality to do things in the organization. And we can start helping you with coaching and coaching styles within leadership. And that's what we're going to do. What problems does that solve? It doesn't solve any problems on its own right. Not that it wouldn't, but it
Yeah, I
probably
think
won't if
that's
you don't think about it.
I think that's really interesting, and it kind of picks up on something else that I talk about in How People Learn, which is this idea of alignment of concerns, which sounds hopelessly philosophical, but in essence, that's what the kind of the 5DI model does, is that at the outset of a conversation, and many of the people listening to this will recognize this, there's something that happens where, the stakeholder, the customer, who is the commissioner, let's say, of the program, will say, look, can you just make a course around this? Can you just build me a course on this topic, or can you take this document and make it into a course, or can you run? And the missed opportunity is to stop that and say, just before we build a course, can I talk to you a little bit about what you're worried about? What is it you're trying to achieve? Because ultimately, there's a hidden assumption there that nobody's typically, of kind of those commissioners are not interested in learning and development per se. They're interested in a certain outcome, and they've made the assumption that education, if you like, will be the way to deliver that outcome. And so what I'm saying is that as part of the model, you should challenge that. And this will be familiar for people who've got a performance consulting background, where you say, hang on just a minute, before we create another e-learning module, let's understand what you're really worried about and what you'd really like to see being done differently. And if we could achieve that in another way, would that be okay? Could we at least have license to try something different? And my experience has been quite often, if you've actually taken the time to listen to people and build the relationship, and they know that you're on the same page, they'll say, yeah, okay, let's give it a go. You won't get a lot of extra time or a lot of extra budget. You don't need it, but you just need to refocus around what's the problem that we're trying to solve.
Yeah, and it's something that we absolutely don't do enough of. And bringing all those together. You mentioned performance consultancy earlier on.
Yeah.
So again, from my experiences, that's something I've tried to bring into the way I consulted when I was a business partner, and further backwards to that as well. And I think you're right that it's the expectation. Yes, we want a training course. That's how it works. There's a checklist here. We've involved training now, so we need that. But then the next thing that seems to come up is that whilst we're thinking about that in a different way, no one else has yet in the organization, so they're unable to resource it. So in terms of challenges there, so as an example, in response to a retraining request, we need to retrain everyone on this 6 months after we did it the first time because they're not doing it. And then I go and speak to the stakeholders. I go and speak to people on the first line and see what the problems are. And the actual issues are that it's really difficult to follow the process. I'm jumping between those systems again. It doesn't give me all the information I want. And I just get really confused with which system I need to be using when. The help system isn't that great. It needs to really all be in one place. So we go back to the stakeholder and I say, this is what I've found. Nah, we're not doing that. It takes too long and we've got no money. So just give us a training. How do we begin to try and influence and change around that? Is it that experimentation you talk about? Is there a bigger picture thing here?
You always or often have to strike a compromise and accept that it's a journey. And so that's the kind of high level answer to your question. But I recognize that problem really well. It's something I've encountered in lots of different industries in my consulting work. And in effect, we're saying that people aren't performing in the way that we want them to perform because we've made it really hard for them to do it. We've got systems which are difficult to search. We've got obscure procedures. We've got things which are difficult to follow, which don't take into account the context in which they're operating. Yeah. And if you get the opportunity to do that piece of analysis, then you can present back to your stakeholder, this is what it would take to fix the problem. And then, as you say, sometimes they'll say, oh, that looks complicated. But what I've found is that there will be some cheap, quick things that you can do. So if you take kind of onboarding, for example, we've done a lot of work with onboarding, and one thing that people find really helpful is a simple, easy to follow checklist, or a list of kind of top 10 mistakes to avoid, or a glossary, of terms, or, that sort of thing. And so within what might be quite a complicated answer to the question, how do you actually fix performance and improve performance across this piece? You might be able to identify simple, quick things that you can build into the model, which will be significantly more impactful than actually just building a course, or in addition to building a course.
Again, you made me think about going back to my times as actually frontline trainer in call centers, and yeah, 3 or 4 week inductions. And that first day or two, you talk about a checklist. It felt like I was just deflecting questions all the time about things like, when do we get paid? What's payday?
Yeah.
Who do I give the P45 to? Where do I get my ID badge so I can get around the organization? Where am I going to be sitting? Or, all these logistical
Yeah,
questions.
do you know what I did? I did a consulting piece of work around it, and it was bananas what was happening. It was a big call center, and we talked to some of the people about their onboarding. It was like 6 weeks or something of training, and here's the really funny thing. So they would lose a lot of people through that process because
Yeah.
people would sign up. They're like, "Blimey, I just can't take any more of this." And secondly, somebody literally said, all of the stuff that they teach you up in on the 5th floor in that 6 weeks of training is completely different to how we actually work like down here. And I was like, oh wow, so actually even if you remembered any of that 6 weeks of training, it wouldn't be any good. And then when we talked to them, we discovered that they didn't remember hardly any of it, as you would. I mean, 6 weeks of, they were just, it was mind numbing. And the upshot was, well, you could probably just produce some checklists that they could actually use as their on calls and actually cut that down to 1 week.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, that's a massive opportunity for the business, but it's also much better as an experience for those individuals who just they just want to do the job, really. um,
Absolutely.
so the disconnect is sometimes so dramatic that it's just kind of obvious how to fix the problem with a performance consulting approach.
Well, yeah, those checklists, but also again coming back to the systems, because I kind of go. I mean, one of the things, as you can imagine, working in kind of contact center environments for about a decade, was how to identify and verify your customer as they came
Mm,
through. And then one
yeah,
of the big things associated then with that, or one of the large problems, was people not doing it incorrectly, because there's a big compliance risk around that, and
yeah.
data security and all that sort of stuff. Completely get it, absolutely fine. And what happened was, obviously, we've got the training, as you have to do. You go through it in a simulator and it's lovely. And
Mm,
there's been updates on the live system and it doesn't look like that anymore. But good news, we've got a resource on the knowledge system that takes you through exactly what you need to be pressing in which order. And if this type of call, these are the things you need to do. Great. And people still getting it wrong. And for me, the
mm,
simplest question in the world is, why don't you create it so the system doesn't allow you to get it wrong?
yeah.
Well, we can't do that. That takes too long. But again, from a customer point of view, I can't get into my account illegally or incorrectly. It challenges me to give the right information. And if I don't have it, I don't get into the account. So surely it's got to be easy to do that. So how long is it before we actually start getting to that point rather than an
Yeah,
L&D? Again,
yeah.
I guess full circle, we're getting rid of the learning almost here now, but before that penny drops, what's stopping that?
So you've actually connected up all the dots, and I think that's fascinating. And some of the people listening to this might be interested in that actually we have these, what I think are sometimes quite empty conversations about, learning maturity, where effectively people are just kind of stacking the latest products in a pile. But the reality is there's some kind of trajectory
Mm,
from courses to resources to guidance to automation, and that trajectory is very specifically externalizing capability. Now
mm,
we can have a big conversation around the ethics of that, whether we like it, whether we don't, pros and cons, blah blah blah. It's inevitable, is what I would say in a slightly Marvel kind of fashion. But what I'm saying is, with a course, what you're saying is, hold all this stuff in your head. And we're starting to realize that that's a really limited and ineffective approach, because people forget it, and things are just changing too fast. So
mm,
now you could start building resources, which is what we use with Google. It's like, you don't actually need to hold all this stuff in your head. You don't need to have a library of information. We don't need to invest as much in learning. We just need to build the right resources to support you at those points of need. But the problem is, how do you know which resource to use?
mm.
Well, we got some whizzy thing where you can search. Wouldn't it be better if the system knew, well, you're about to have this conversation, you're about to do this, here's the right resource. Now that starts to look like guidance. It starts to look like sat nav. Sat nav doesn't say, here's the map for where you are. It
Yeah.
says, turn left, turn right. And then you realize, if you're following the sat nav analogy, you're only a short step away from automation, because you've effectively externalized the rules of operation in your performance guidance and your resources. And that is the migration path to automation. For those industries and organizations thinking about how to do it, it is via that transition from courses to resources to guidance to automation. You can try and do it in one big step, but it will go hopelessly wrong, because the people to do the automation will be working with the standard operating procedures. And what you'll learn is that the people in the business aren't actually running to those standard operating procedures. So you need to understand what are they actually doing. And that's what the process we go through to build performance support and resources.
So how much do you think, because I completely agree with that, because I think, you know, in every other form of our life, that's where we're trying to get to. In fact, when I was reading what you said about that in the book, it made me immediately think, probably a little bit of a blast into my my psyche here, made me think about Back to the Future and the self-tying Nike trainers. That's exactly what we're getting. I don't
I
need
like
to
that.
spend
Yeah,
a
yeah.
week trying to
Yeah.
teach my child to tie his laces, because he can either use
Yeah.
Velcro or buy these new Nike
Yeah.
ones that just do it for you. Absolutely brilliant. And here's the
Or
hoverboard.
slide rules. Do you remember slide rules? I bet you don't. But
Yeah, I do,
yeah.
yeah.
Oh yeah, that's yeah. Yeah, I know what you mean.
But it's true. So I think we are getting that. Now, because we are in those instances, we are the consumer.
Hmm.
To what degree do you think, going back to kind of that Dave Ulrich argument about being made redundant, do you think that L&D and leadership within L&D fight against it? So there's actually a reluctance to really see that through when the revolution started, because it's self-preservation kicks in, and
Yeah.
we're knowledgeable and
Yeah.
we do courses and e-learning. That's what we're good at. We don't want no
Yeah.
learning.
Well, look, I mean, it's mindset that's holding people back. But you know, your livelihood is on the line. Is I try to put it as stark as possible for people, which is, if you think that there's some kind of future in trying to stuff content into people's heads, then the trend is not your friend. Because that's what you're doing today. I don't care if you call it microlearning or e-learning or whatever. Effectively, that you think that's what your job is, then it's gloomy. Your prospects are gloomy. If you can switch the mindset of, actually, no, we're going to help people perform. We're going to find ways to actually support them at points of need. It doesn't have to be learning. It can just be useful stuff. You know, we're going to smooth their experience of performing this organization. Then the future is bright. But frankly, I think, and a number of people have noticed this, not just me, that there's a threat that somebody who isn't emotionally invested in education, an external organization, who doesn't have all the baggage, will spot that opportunity and actually start to capitalize on it. Bring it into sharp focus. What if somebody persuasive, some Silicon Valley startup, says, here is a performance guidance app for all your leaders that tells them how to navigate the HR complexities and the relationship complexity of leadership, and it's proven to improve leadership performance, over a period of time. It's kind of game over for all those people stuffing leaders into courses. So, just mind the gap, I guess.
I think, you mentioned that. I think there's some of that already happening. I mean, without mentioning company names, there are software companies I've seen that are actively creating software that links into things like your CRM packages, your sales systems,
Yeah,
that will navigate you through as a plugin what you're
yeah,
doing and when you're trying to do it. So it's coming. I mean, I think,
yeah.
again, at the moment, the cost seems to be the prohibitive thing there, because it's not kind of forward thinking enough, I guess. But it's only so long, I guess, before people who are making the systems go, hang on a minute, we can build that within it. You mentioned leadership.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry.
I would just before you go on to that, I think the stumbling block there is data. Having enough contextual data. It's actually quite hard to say to a leader, this minute at this point, this would be the best course of action. But that contextual data is coming. That's what I mean about the direction of travel. We can do it with SatNav. You only need a couple of bits of data. We need to know where you are now, where you want to get to, and what the map is. We can start doing something quite similar with a surprising number of roles. Then actually, you can actually start to create a system which will perform measurably better than kind of learning, which is hit and miss at best.
Yeah, it's breaking out of our bubble as well, because,
Yeah.
you've mentioned data, and it's one of the things that it actually gets my back up a little bit. Like some things like emotional intelligence training and objection handling training and difficult conversations, all these sort of things, they get me back up a little bit, because I go, unless we actually get out of our bubble, the data that we will find will likely mirror the data we've been using for years, which is we'll make training decisions based on our training needs analysis data, our review data, evaluation data, our happy sheet data, and it probably isn't going to change anything that we do. But actually, what we really need to do is get out and find all the business, and as you say, the contextual data that relates, and again, to use your language, with relates to the concerns that the company actually have and the people within it actually have, and then decide how we can support to move those things rather than just use our own.
Yeah, yeah, I agree.
So leadership you mentioned there, and I think, also kind of blending into your 5DI model as well. How do we leadership development? So much has been spent on leadership development over the last 20 years across the world. It's eye-watering when you start reading some of the statistics on it. And one of the main reasons I think now people are hesitant to actually roll more out is because it hasn't worked in the past, and they don't want to spend more money doing it again. So how do we make this more real for leaders? How do we actually create an environment for first-time leaders where
I
they're
think
more comfortable?
I think it's a completely different equation. I think it's not that leadership development hasn't worked. It's done what our commissioners wanted it to do, which is we've been selling events. And that's great, because if you're a leader, you want to feel valued. You want to go away for a few days, sit in a hotel, network with friends, feel that you belong, feel part of a group, get a sense of what it means to be a leader. And that's all good. We've just pretended that, it's had something to do with learning and development or whatever in a more kind of narrow sense. And so this is why sometimes we'll say to people, oh, because somebody will say, well, we want, a leadership program, it needs to be 3 days long. Look, I'll tell you a story, because I'll be completely honest. I did, because you said earlier on, I think, which is a really good point, that we've been complicit in this, to some degree, and I think I have. And I've just tried to improve, basically. So there was a time where I was asked to design a leadership program, and we built this whole thing to engineer behavioral change, and set habits over time and some resources. And then we sat with a senior stakeholder, and the guy said, yeah, you know what, I think just people want a couple of days in a hotel. And I realized I hadn't really heard that it wasn't about learning. It never was. These leadership events aren't about learning. They're about something more important, in a way, which is about a sense of a rite of passage, their sense of valuing people. And this has a real impact, but we're just not quantifying it. So that's why there's a disconnect when learning people say, I'm not sure it's very effective use of learning spend to put people in a hotel. And our client says, but that's what we want to do. It's because they're trying to achieve something different. So I don't think it's as simple as saying that hasn't worked. I'm just saying it hasn't worked for us. And maybe we're part of the problem. So I do think that experiences are really important. So in case anybody's got the impression from listening to this that I'm just kind of like, well, strip out all the experiences and just do performance support instead. I just think it's about understanding what mechanisms achieve what outcome. You can really transform somebody with the right experience if it's carefully designed. But what you're trying to do with that experience is not the educational thing where they sit down and memorize a bunch of stuff and we do a quiz at the end. What you're trying to do with that is give people a chance to practice something, for example, coaching conversations or difficult conversations, or something you can't do with a checklist, something which requires that development of deeper capability, that can only be done through some kind of very first-hand impactful experience. So I think that's the answer to your question, is that we can continue with experiences, we can create really powerful experiences, but we shouldn't be sending people into lecture rooms to just sit and listen to somebody talk, if that's what we're going to do.
Definitely. I mean, it makes me think of, I talk about training and learning return on investment quite a lot, but what I actually talk about at the same time and for the same amount of time is return on expectation. And I think that's what you're talking about there, to kind of go, let's do that. What is the expectation of running that event? And if the answer is, well, so many times actually when I do kind of initial consultancy piece, one of the drivers to talk to me has been to go, well, we actually just want to invest in our guys. They've not had really any investment in themselves. We just want to give them some upskill, some new skills, and then chat with them from there about where it goes in the future.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, because what's that going to achieve? Well, that's going to achieve that, they've just been on the wheel, spinning round for so many years, and it just actually makes them feel valued in the organization. Well, that's great. That's the expectation. There's no expectation that because they've done 2 hours talking about the GROW model with a coaching facilitator, that they're now going to be the greatest coach ever known to man. It's going to impact your performance at the bottom. No, that's not what we want. Brilliant.
It's funny. It's absolutely right. When when I was doing a lot of work at BP and actually defining the kind of leadership program there, we did that with focus groups. We do with everything. We talked to leaders. One of the kind of warm-up questions was, what's been your best experience of the organization? And it struck me as remarkable how many people would mention those leadership, experiences that they've been on as being some of the best experiences of the organization since they've been there for years. And it's like, well, the fact that you're not quantifying that doesn't mean that it hasn't impacted. I suppose colors affects their whole perception of the organization. The investment the organization made in them at that point, is distinct in terms of its impact on performance and engagement, but it's not inconsequential. The way to assess that is not to say, well, how much do you remember from that? And they say, well, I don't know, a couple of things. Oh, well, that was a waste of time. Let's do e-learning. It's just completely wrong-headed.
Yeah. How much did you remember from the e-learning? Even less.
Yeah, but it was cheaper, right?
It was cheaper. Got out quicker. Didn't need anyone delivering it. Brilliant.
Yeah.
No, mate, I think you're right, because I went on a leadership development. It was a program when I was at Sky, and one of the best things about that, there was one or two things that stuck with me forever in terms of things I now apply in terms of frameworks.
Yeah.
One of the main things that stuck with me was that I was the only person from the learning and development area that went onto it. So I was surrounded by sales leaders and tech leaders. And I think both ways, that was really, really valuable, because neither of us knew, as well as they did, the context of their environment. We didn't know the people challenges. We didn't know the personalities, because when you see them practicing coaching on each other, it would be, I know Dave's like that. So I get why you're struggling. I couldn't do that. So I'd be going, all right, well, why do you think Dave's doing that? And it was a different avenue completely. They'd never been asked that question. And it wasn't particularly, it certainly wasn't by design. It wasn't because it was a course. It was just an experience again.
Yeah. Experience design. So that's what I'm kind of, at the risk of sort of summarizing that model. Effectively, 5DI says talk to your customers, because you're not going to know how to help them, frankly, if you don't talk to them. You're just going to be dumping content at them. And then you're either doing experience design, where you want some more profound change in their capability, or you're building resources, you're doing performance support. That's all we're doing. We talk to people, we figure out if it's an experience or a resource, and that's it in a nutshell. But it's that mindset shift, as I said, that it's really tough to get through.
So we're kind of talking about the outputs there. So in terms of return on investment, we've mentioned return on expectation. I put a post on. It was actually only last night onto LinkedIn. It's an analogy I use quite a lot, but I just built on it, which was, if you get a bad omelette, it doesn't mean the egg was bad. But at the same time, if the egg is good, that doesn't mean you get a great omelette. And I see learning in that way, that quite often, because of the way it's asked for and pitched, we kind of go, oh, well, that hasn't worked, so the training must have been rubbish, or the e-learning must have been rubbish. Or at the same time, it was really good, and we've got what we wanted. I doubt it. What's going on there in terms of that ROI? So my opinion on this is that it's very difficult to actually pinpoint what the return on investment is for what we currently do, or even what we really want to do, because there are so many ingredients that go into it. So whilst you might be creating experiences for people and they're learning from each other, there are other things like, for example, marketing campaigns, the systems, again, the styles of leadership. So as a good example, from the call center days, that it might be that there's big runs on the call center simply because there's pay-per-view events that actually bring, despite the best resourcing attempts, it brings an unqualified demand on the business, and they can't quite handle it at certain times. And that can impact the metrics that we're supposedly trying to influence. So how do you think, can we measure a return on investment? Or is it like the egg, it's just an ingredient with a bunch of other ingredients that need to come together, and we should forget about measuring that, because it's all about the actual endpoint? And if we're getting the endpoints with those ingredients, great.
Yeah, there's a couple of positions on this. I think when I was at the BBC, somebody said something which stuck with me. It's funny. She said, you don't fatten a pig by weighing it. I thought, well, that's an interesting perspective. It's like, well, but I mean, you might want to know which food is working for them. So I take that point, but I think there's a sense in which you're going to have to make some investments around certain areas like engagement and so on. If you want to, improve. We don't measure the investment on email It's kind of everyone
Mm.
has an email system. Where are we measuring the return on that investment in email systems? So, but there's a counter to that, which I think is more my position, frankly, which is, and it's part of the 5DI, is I think it's really hindered us that we had Kirkpatrick, because it provided a fig leaf effectively. So it was like, well, we can't actually tell you what the impact on performance is because that's terribly complicated. So we'll provide you a level 1 and 2. And
Yeah.
level 1 and 2 is always rigged. It is basically, did you like the course? And, we can get some data out of whether or not people remembered anything. And so that's prevented us from actually tackling the question around effectiveness of L&D. And so every so often somebody comes along and they poke that, and then we transform the organization. But in essence, what 5DI says, the first stage, define, is can we just say what the measurable outcome of this program would be, expressed in terms of either behaviors or performance? And then can we design something which then, aims at changing those behaviors, and then can we measure them? So I think that regardless of whether or not you accept that model, that's a better kind of premise, which is, can we just be clear at the outset, what is the behavioral change that we'd expect to see if this was successful, and then engineer a program which is designed to drive that, and then where the opportunity exists, actually check whether or not it's changed his behaviors. And I don't think it's that hard to do once you kind of get stuck into it. So that's my answer, is that I do think it's possible to see a return on investment, certainly at what you might call level 3, even potentially level 4 level. And I just think if we design programs differently, we'll be in a much stronger position as an organization to actually defend our existence.
Yeah. Well, I think as well, it's coming back to something we mentioned earlier, which is around experimentation. Because if we just pin our hopes on one form, we've done a training course for these 8,000 people, or there's an e-learning that's going to go out to these 16,000 people, then we live or die by that sword. But if we can just, I think we mentioned earlier on that first change that people can make is to have that conversation to say, could we try something different with 1 or 2 teams, maybe 2 or 3 different things with 2 or 3 different teams? Then so you might not get any return with some teams. Actually, that team might be performing a hell of a lot better. Let's learn. Let's actually try and manufacture mistakes and success rather than just try and point the blame for them.
Well, let me use an analogy which is, again, sort of slightly provocative, but I've used a few times, I've used with colleagues, is that there's a real risk that what we've effectively done is we've set up an internal pizza business. And what I mean by that is, if you actually did that in your business, it would work, because there are people who are working late, or perhaps in the old world there were people working late on a Friday night who would order the pizza. There are people who want to celebrate something. There are people who just want to have a weekly pizza day. And pretty soon you'd find that you've got, a little team of people who are shipping out pizza quite dependably, to different parts of the business. And you'd start tracking metrics, and your metrics would be activity. It's like, how many pizzas are we shipping to different parts of the business? And you'd track level 2. Do they like them? How are they scoring on a 1 to 5? This year we've improved from a 4.1 to a 4.6. We did that by, putting anchovies on, blah, 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 blah. And then you'd have some, like, a percentage of uneaten pizzas, so, some of our pizzas aren't being eaten. We've seen them left lying around cold. That's a bad thing. We need to change that. And that whole economy could exist without anybody actually answering the question, but is this doing anyone any good, or the business any good? And so that, I think, is one way of thinking about our learning organizations, which is that if we don't travel into that level 3 and level 4 space, there is a very real risk that we are basically just running a pizza business, and people just accept that's the way it is, because every company has a little internal pizza team, right? Until somebody comes along and says, bloody hell, do we even need this? Or somebody switches it off, and it's like, well, there's a few people complaining that we're not getting pizza, but the business hasn't fallen over.
And we've saved a bunch of money by not having to make pizza every day.
Yeah.
But it's things like that. I've used very similar analogies that around, I think I've used, we're there to kind of hold the buckets when there's leaks in the ceiling, and also kind of stick the fingers in the dam when it starts leaking. And before we know it, 6 months later, we've gone on accredited courses to make us like dam building experts and bucket holding mentors and all that sort of stuff. And then someone just says, we don't need dams anymore. And hang on a minute, we're not learning experts anymore. What do we do with this? Help. Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, that's brilliant. What I'd like to get onto now is, I think that, coming towards the end, The idea of the Leadership Untitled podcast is that obviously it's untitled when we start, and then by the end of it, we agree based on what we've talked about what we should call the episode. Now I've always jotted down a few ideas, but I'm always keen to get the opinion of my guest first. So based on where we've been and what we've talked about, what are your thoughts?
My thought is, when you don't know the answer, step back and think about the process. So the process should be, the title of this should be whatever is most appealing to the audience, or whatever resonates with the audience. So my first challenge would be, I shouldn't be titling it, because that will just reflect what fascinates me. It should be the audience like, well, that's the most fascinating part of what this bloke said. And since we can't have the audience in advance of that, I think you're closer to them than I am, which is a roundabout way of saying, I think you should decide, of the things that we talked about, what do you think your audience would be most taken by?
Damn you, Nick.
There we are. You see, wriggled out of that one.
Well, I'll tell you, the bit that made me smile was you don't fatten a pig by weighing it. I thought it was fantastic. I can see that.
It's not even everywhere. Mine. It's not even mine. Well, I think it's maybe it's either that or are you running a pizza business, or I don't know. But yes, I'm happy to go with whatever you think will excite and interest and intrigue people.
Right. I will do is I'll put it in a little bag and draw out which one. And I'll tag it on the bottom of there. Yeah. That's brilliant stuff.
Yeah.
If anyone would like to get in touch with you or find out more about what you do, and obviously get the book, where can they do that?
Oh, blimey, I haven't said what I do. I wrote a book called How People Learn. You can get it on, Amazon, I think. And I head up learning at Deloitte in the UK. And if they want to get in touch with me, I'm quite active on Twitter. So, frankly, given the deluge of stuff that I get on LinkedIn, actually just connecting on Twitter seems to be the most reliable way of getting a hold of me.
Perfect. So what I'll do is I'll include a link to that book for anyone listening, so you can go off there and get that, and also your Twitter account, and you can get inundated now with questions on the back of what we've been talking about today and what the hell we talk about weighing pigs and what that means.
Thanks, Sean. I've enjoyed it. Yeah,
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Pizza.
Pigs and pizza. Oh, this is that's why I got into L&D.
Yeah. All right.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Have a great day, and I'll speak again soon.
Thank you. Cheers, Rob.
Bye now. Bye. So that brings us to the end of this episode of the Leadership Untitled podcast. This episode will be called Pigs and Pizzerias, thanks to the anecdotes that Nick shared with us. All that remains is to thank Nick again, and also listeners out there for tuning in to our conversation. If you've not done so already, please remember to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss future episodes. And also, if you'd like to get in touch with me, please find me, Rob Moores, on LinkedIn, and also my company page on there, Rob Moores Consulting, as well as www.robmoores.com. Until next time, bye now.